Have you ever wondered how an 8-year-old boy could change the fate of an entire kingdom? Today's story takes us back thousands of years, when a small child ascended the throne and turned Judah from spiritual collapse into a time of prosperity. This is the story of Josiah the youngest and one of the greatest kings of Israel. In his time, the land of Judah was drowning in darkness, idolatry was widespread, and the temple of the Lord lay in ruins. But at just 8 years old, Josiah began a journey that no one could have expected. Josiah ascended to the throne of Judah at the tender age of 8, an age when most children are still learning the basics of life, let alone carrying the weight of a kingdom on their shoulders. Yet this young boy was thrust into a position of immense power and responsibility, inheriting a nation amid moral and spiritual decay. The kingdom of Judah had fallen far from its former glory under kings like David and Solomon, and now it was teetering on the brink of collapse. The situation was dire. For decades, the people of Judah had strayed further and further from their covenant with God, worshiping false gods, engaging in idolatry, and neglecting the laws that had once guided their ancestors. The great temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, which had once been the heart of their faith, was now in ruins, neglected and profaned by the very people who were supposed to care for it. Pagan altars dotted the landscape, and the moral compass of the nation seemed to have vanished entirely. Josiah's father, King Amon, and his grandfather, King Manasseh, were among the most wicked rulers Judah had ever known. Their reigns were marked by corruption, injustice, and a complete abandonment of the ways of the Lord. Under their leadership, the people of Judah had become accustomed to idolatry, and the nation was spiraling toward disaster. The very laws of Moses, the foundation of the covenant between God and Israel, had been forgotten, lost to generations of neglect and disobedience. Imagine being an 8-year-old child in this environment, surrounded by advisors who were either complicit in the corruption or powerless to stop it. Josiah's young mind must have been filled with questions. How could a boy, born into a lineage of wicked kings, possibly change the course of an entire nation? How could someone so young and inexperienced lead Judah back to righteousness and restore its covenant with God? The odds were stacked against him. But Josiah was no ordinary child. From a young age, he displayed a pearl of wisdom and maturity far beyond his years. Though the Bible does not give us many details about his upbringing, it is clear that he was surrounded by a few faithful advisors who helped guide him during his early years on the throne. These advisors, likely including the high priest Hilkiah and the scribe Shaphan, played a crucial role in shaping Josiah's spiritual journey. They planted the seeds of faith in his heart, teaching him the ancient traditions of Israel and the stories of his ancestors, such as David and Solomon, who had led the nation during times of great devotion to God. Josiah's curiosity and hunger for truth began to grow. As he learned more about his people's history and their relationship with God, he must have felt a deep sense of responsibility to restore Judah to its former glory, not in terms of wealth or military power, but in terms of faith and obedience to the Lord. He began to see that the key to Judah's future lay in its past in the covenant that God had made with Israel through Moses. The young king understood that to save his nation, he would have to lead it back to God. The challenges Josiah faced were monumental. How could he reverse generations of apostasy and corruption? How could he restore a nation that had completely lost its way? And how could a mere child, with no experience in governance, possibly succeed where so many others had failed? The Bible tells us that Josiah began to take an active role in governing Judah at a young age. By the time he was 16, he was already seeking the God of his ancestor David, and it was clear that he was determined to lead Judah in a new direction. His youth, which could have been a disadvantage, proved to be a hidden strength. Free from the corrupting influences that had shaped his predecessors, Josiah was able to see clearly what needed to be done. He was not beholden to the old ways of thinking that had led Judah astray, and his youthful idealism gave him the courage to make bold decisions that would transform his kingdom. One of the first steps Josiah took was to begin purging Judah of its idolatrous practices. He knew that the people had fallen into deep spiritual decay, and that to restore true worship of God, he would need to eliminate the false gods and pagan altars that had become so prevalent throughout the land. This was no small task. Many in Judah had grown up with these idolatrous practices and considered them to be a normal part of life. But Josiah was undeterred. He understood that true reform required drastic measures. The Bible recounts that at the age of 20, Josiah began a campaign to rid Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the Asherah poles, and the carved and cast images that were used in idol worship. He supervised the destruction of these pagan altars, tearing them down and grinding the idols to powder. Josiah's actions were not just symbolic, they were a clear demonstration of his commitment to restoring true worship in Judah. He knew that he could not simply make personal changes, he had to lead his entire nation in repentance. Josiah's reforms did not stop at the borders of Judah. He extended his campaign northward into territories that had once belonged to the kingdom of Israel, which had been conquered by the Assyrians years earlier. Although these areas were no longer under Judah's control, Josiah felt a deep responsibility to purify all the land that God had promised to Israel. His reforms reached as far as Naphtali and Manasseh, regions that had been steeped in idolatry for generations. At the age of 26, Josiah undertook one of the most significant projects of his reign, the restoration of the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. This was a crucial step in the spiritual renewal of Judah. The temple, once the center of worship and the symbol of God's presence among his people, had been neglected and profaned for years. By restoring it, Josiah was making a clear statement that Judah was returning to its covenant with God. During the restoration of the temple, an incredible discovery was made. The high priest Hilkiah found the book of the law, the very words that God had given to Moses. This book had been lost for generations, and its rediscovery was a pivotal moment in Josiah's reforms. When the contents of the book were read to Josiah, he was deeply moved. The Bible tells us that he tore his clothes in grief, realizing just how far his people had strayed from God's commandments. Josiah's response was immediate. He summoned all the people of Judah to the temple and had the book of the law read aloud to them. Together, they renewed their covenant with God, pledging to follow his commandments with all their hearts and souls. Josiah's reign was marked by a genuine desire to lead his people back to God. His reforms were not just superficial changes, they were a complete overhaul of the nation's spiritual and moral life. He understood that true worship of God required not only the destruction of idols, but also a renewal of the people's hearts and minds. Through his leadership, Josiah was able to bring about a period of spiritual renewal in Judah, one that would be remembered for generations to come. But Josiah's story is also a reminder of the fragility of reform. Despite his best efforts, the people of Judah would eventually fall back into idolatry after his death. Yet, his legacy endures as a powerful example of what can be achieved when a leader is fully devoted to following God's will. As Josiah ascended to the throne at such a tender age, the weight of a kingdom's destiny rested on his shoulders. It would have been easy for a boy, barely old enough to comprehend the magnitude of his responsibilities, to be swayed by the forces around him. Judah was in spiritual disarray, with idolatry, corruption, and moral decay infecting every level of society. The kings before him, especially his father Ammon and his grandfather Manasseh, had steered the kingdom far from the path of righteousness, leading the people into idol worship and away from the God of Israel. But despite the deeply rooted evil practices of his lineage, Josiah's reign took an unexpected turn, thanks in large part to the loyal and godly advisors who surrounded him. From an early age, Josiah was blessed with the counsel of faithful men who had not lost hope in the God of their ancestors. These advisors, including likely figures like the high priest Hilkiah and the scribe Shaphan, were key in shaping Josiah's spiritual outlook. Though the Bible doesn't provide a detailed account of Josiah's early education, it is safe to infer that these men played a critical role in educating the young king about the rich history and spiritual legacy of Israel. They would have shared stories of King David's righteous reign, Solomon's wisdom, and the covenant God made with Israel through Moses. In a time when most of Judah had forgotten God, these advisors remained steadfast, pointing the young Josiah toward the truth. It was through their mentorship that Josiah began to understand the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just inheriting a throne, he was inheriting a spiritual crisis. The nation had fallen so far from the principles set by Moses and the prophets that even the very laws of God, once the cornerstone of Israel's identity, had been lost. The temple, once the heart of worship in Jerusalem, was in ruins, and the people had become so accustomed to pagan practices that the worship of false gods was considered normal. The task before Josiah was nothing less than monumental to restore the faith of a nation and lead them back to their covenant with God. Despite his young age, Josiah was profoundly curious about the ways of the Lord. His heart was stirred by the stories he heard of how Israel once thrived under God's guidance. He must have often wondered why his kingdom had fallen into such a state of decay and what could be done to reverse its downward spiral. This curiosity, combined with the wisdom imparted by his advisors, ignited in Josiah a passion for spiritual reform. He was determined to not only learn about God's commandments, but to live them out and enforce them across his kingdom. As Josiah grew older, his faith deepened. By the time he reached his teenage years, the seeds of spiritual renewal planted by his advisors began to bear fruit. At the age of 16, Josiah made the pivotal decision to seek the God of his ancestor David. This was no small commitment for a young king surrounded by the temptations of power and wealth. Josiah's choice to turn to God was a clear sign that he had rejected the path of his father and grandfather, choosing instead to follow the example of the godly kings who had gone before him. This spiritual awakening marked a turning point in Josiah's life and in the history of Judah. His advisors, who had faithfully guided him through his childhood, must have been overjoyed to see the young king take such a bold step of faith. They had carefully nurtured his knowledge of the scriptures and the history of Israel, and now they were witnessing the fruits of their labor. Josiah wasn't just learning about God's laws, he was beginning to feel a deep, personal connection to the divine. The Bible tells us that in the 12th year of Josiah's reign, when he was 20 years old, he began to take concrete steps to reform the nation. This was no small feat, as the kingdom had been steeped in idolatry for generations. But Josiah, empowered by his growing faith and guided by his loyal advisors, set out to rid Judah of its false gods. He began by purifying the land of Judah and Jerusalem, tearing down the altars of Baal and other pagan idols. The carved images and molten statues that had polluted the land were destroyed, and the high places where the people had once worshipped these false gods were dismantled. This act of purification was dangerous. Josiah was challenging deeply ingrained practices that many in Judah had grown up with. For some, these pagan rituals were all they had ever known, but Josiah was unwavering in his commitment to restore true worship to his people. His advisors stood by him, offering wisdom and encouragement as he carried out these bold reforms. Their influence on the young king had been instrumental in shaping his resolve. Without their guidance, it's possible that Josiah could have been swayed by the forces of idolatry that surrounded him. But thanks to their faithful mentorship, Josiah remained steadfast. One of the most significant influences on Josiah's spiritual growth was the rediscovery of the Book of the Law. This moment, which occurred during the restoration of the temple, was a monumental event in Josiah's reign. The high priest Hilkiah found the Book of the Law, likely containing parts of the Torah, which had been lost during the years of apostasy. When the book was read to Josiah, his reaction was one of profound humility and repentance. The young king tore his clothes in sorrow, realizing just how far his people had strayed from the commandments of God. Josiah's response to the reading of the law was a testament to the spiritual foundation that had been laid by his advisors. Their teachings had prepared his heart to receive the word of God, and when the moment came, Josiah responded with the sincerity and devotion that would define his reign. His advisors, particularly Hilkiah and Shaphan, played a crucial role in not only discovering the book of the law, but also in helping Josiah understand its significance. With the book of the law in hand, Josiah initiated a series of even more drastic reforms. He summoned all the people of Judah, from the least to the greatest, and read the words of the law aloud to them. In a powerful public act, Josiah renewed the covenant between God and the people, committing himself and his kingdom to follow the Lord with all their heart and soul. This moment of national repentance and renewal was the culmination of Josiah's spiritual journey, a journey that had been nurtured and guided by his loyal advisors from the very beginning. Josiah's leadership was a shining example of how faith, when nurtured by wise and godly counsel, can lead to profound transformation. His reign was a testament to the power of mentorship, as his advisors played an instrumental role in shaping his spiritual growth. They didn't just guide Josiah, they helped him become a leader who would restore faith to an entire nation. Their influence on the young king reminds us of the importance of surrounding ourselves with wise and faithful mentors who can help us navigate the challenges of life and grow in our relationship with God. Josiah's journey shows us the power of faith, guidance, and the impact that a single life can have on the world. His story encourages us to seek wisdom from those who have walked the path of faith before us and to remain steadfast in our spiritual journeys. If this story of a young king's transformation has inspired you, why not share it with someone who could use a little encouragement today? Josiah's great reforms to cleanse Judah, a transformation that reverberated through the ages. At the tender age of 16, King Josiah began one of the most significant and daring undertakings in the history of the kingdom of Judah. Born into an environment steeped in idolatry and corruption, Josiah's path to leadership was unexpected and extraordinary. As he matured, it became clear that his reign would mark a monumental shift, not only in Judah's political sphere, but also in its spiritual and religious life. From the beginning of his reign, Josiah was acutely aware of the spiritual decay that had gripped Judah. The once great kingdom, known for its devotion to the God of Israel under kings like David and Solomon, had descended into a state of moral and religious decline. Foreign gods were worshipped openly, pagan altars dotted the landscape, and the once sacred temple in Jerusalem had fallen into disrepair. Josiah, however, refused to allow this state of affairs to continue. As he approached the age of 16, a fire ignited within him a profound spiritual awakening that would set the stage for a series of sweeping reforms. Josiah's journey towards spiritual leadership was not an easy one. His predecessors, including his father, King Amon, and grandfather, King Manasseh, had led the people into idolatry, forsaking the ways of the Lord. Yet Josiah's heart was different. He sought to return Judah to its roots, to the covenant between God and the people of Israel. In his 8th year as king, while still young, he began to seek the God of his ancestor David. It was this deepening relationship with God that gave him the courage to challenge the status quo and initiate reforms that would change the nation. At 16, Josiah embarked on a mission that no one could have predicted. Despite his youth, he understood the gravity of the situation and the monumental task ahead of him. His first step was to cleanse Judah of its pagan altars and places of idol worship. The high places where people worshipped false gods were scattered throughout the kingdom. These high places had become centers of spiritual corruption, and Josiah knew that if Judah were to return to true worship, these places had to be torn down. The Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles 34:3, in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his ancestor David. And in his 12th year he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, carved idols, and cast images. This marked the beginning of a dramatic spiritual transformation. Josiah's zeal for purifying the land was not just an act of political leadership, it was a personal mission driven by his deep faith and love for God. The removal of these high places was not just a symbolic gesture. For centuries, the people of Judah had strayed from the ways of the Lord, embracing the gods of their neighbors. They had built altars to Baal, worshipped the Asherah poles, and sacrificed to idols made of wood and stone. Josiah, with the guidance of godly advisors such as the high priest Hilkiah, knew that these practices had to be eradicated if the people were to return to the covenant relationship with God. As Josiah matured and his understanding of God's law deepened, his reforms became even more radical. At the age of 20, he initiated a second wave of reforms that would go down in history as some of the most aggressive religious purges ever undertaken in Judah. Not content with simply removing the altars and idols, Josiah took the unprecedented step of destroying them entirely. He ground the idols into dust, desecrated the altars, and scattered the ashes on the graves of those who had sacrificed to these false gods. This was not just a cleanup, it was a total eradication of anything that represented a rebellion against the one true God. The book of 2 Chronicles 34:4 describes Josiah's actions in vivid detail under his direction. The altars of the Baals were torn down, he cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them, and smashed the Asherah poles, the idols, and the images. These he broke to pieces and scattered over the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. This was a complete and thorough destruction of every trace of idol worship in the kingdom. Josiah's actions were bold and controversial, but he was undeterred. He was determined to lead Judah back to the true worship of the Lord, no matter the cost. Josiah's reforms didn't stop at Judah's borders. With the weakening of Assyrian power and the northern kingdom of Israel in disarray, Josiah extended his reforms beyond Judah into the territories of Manasseh, Ephraim, and even Naphtali. These regions had long been under Assyrian control, but Josiah felt a deep responsibility to purify all the land that had once belonged to the people of Israel. His reforms reached into these northern territories, tearing down altars, smashing idols, and purifying the land. This expansion of his religious reforms was unprecedented, demonstrating Josiah's commitment to restoring the entire nation to its former spiritual glory. The culmination of Josiah's reforms came with the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem. After years of neglect, the temple, the center of worship for the God of Israel, had fallen into ruin. In the 18th year of his reign, Josiah ordered the repair of the temple, a move that symbolized not only the physical restoration of the building, but also the spiritual renewal of the nation. It was during this restoration that the high priest Hilkiah made a discovery that would change everything: the book of the law, likely the Torah, which had been lost for generations. When the contents of the book of the law were read to Josiah, the king was overwhelmed with emotion. He tore his clothes in grief and immediately sought guidance from the Lord. Josiah realized the extent of Judah's disobedience and the severe consequences they faced because of their neglect of God's commandments. This moment of realization spurred Josiah to double down on his reforms, initiating a national revival of faith. Josiah's response to the discovery of the law was profound. He called for a national assembly, where the entire book of the law was read aloud to the people. He renewed the covenant between God and Israel, committing himself and the nation to follow the commandments with all their hearts and souls. This public declaration was a turning point in Judah's history, a moment when the people recommitted themselves to the Lord and began a new chapter of faith and obedience. The reforms of Josiah were not only about the removal of idols and the restoration of the temple. They were about the restoration of true worship and the renewal of a covenant relationship with God. Josiah's determination to cleanse the land and return it to its spiritual roots left a lasting legacy that would be remembered for generations to come. Though Josiah's reign eventually came to a tragic end, his reforms set the stage for a period of religious revival and national renewal. His commitment to God's law and his unyielding zeal for righteousness inspired future generations of leaders and set a standard for godly leadership. Josiah's journey from a young boy king to a bold reformer is a testament to the power of faith and the impact one life can have on an entire nation. His story serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how entrenched in darkness a society may seem, one person fully committed to God can bring about incredible change. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of Josiah's story resonated with you the most? If you found this video inspiring, drop a Josiah in the comments below. If you believe in the power of faith and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming content. The story of Josiah is not just about a young boy becoming a great leader. It's about dedication, loyalty to God, and the unshakable will to restore true worship. Drop an 88 in the comments if this story is inspiring. If you want to explore more miraculous and inspiring stories from the Bible, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our latest videos.